us remember them in our prayers, and I forgot to mention that. So as we begin our class today, when we ended our class last Wednesday night, we had come to the point where a man named Balaam had been hired to come and try to curse the Israelites, right? And he was hired by whom? Balak, right? And Balak was king of what nation of people? Moab, right? The Moabites, who were kinsmen of the Israelites. So Balak had gone and sent up to the Euphrates River to bring Balaam down and try to get him to curse the children of Israel. Was he successful in his attempt to get Balaam to do that? Was Balaam successful in his attempt to try to curse the Israelites? He wasn't, was he? In fact, he gave 4 oracles. We talked about that, where he talked about how blessed they were, that this was the Lord's chosen people, and that God was not man, and God could not lie, and he would not change his promise that he had made, that they wouldn't be cursed. And Balaam's telling Balak, you're wasting your time. I can't do any more than the Lord's told me to do. But he continued yet to try to curse the Israelites, didn't he? Even though the Lord had told him. We remember the story where the Lord told him, Balaam, don't go. And remember, it took him on a donkey, and that still didn't wake him up, but him on the donkey trying to make his own way down there to receive what he thought he was going to get. And you know, the Lord standing there, the angel of the Lord standing there with a sword drawn to kill Balaam, to keep him from going because God had told him not to go. But yet he didn't relent. He still tried to go. And finally we see him say, you know, I know, Lord, I've sinned, when the donkey's talking to him. And the angel of the Lord has appeared and he sees what's going on. I've sinned. But yet he still went, didn't he? So we see this man, Balaam, trying to achieve a goal. And by what we've read so far, what was his goal? What was he trying to achieve? Now when I say goal, let's not talk about what he was asked to achieve, but what he was trying to achieve. Money, riches, wasn't it? He was so plagued by the idea that he could have, you know, what was interesting at first when Balak sent for him, he said, if Balak were to give me his whole house full of gold and silver, there's nothing I could do. But yet, he wanted it, didn't he? He wanted it badly, to the point that he just disregarded everything he knew or everything he should know about God and what God has told him to do. So anyway, we come down to the 4th oracle, and we talked about how he talked about, you know, what would happen to those kingdoms, the Canaanites and all, Mennonites and all these people. And that we even thought that we saw maybe a hint to the Messianic, right? Talking about the Christ, because he talks about a king that will subdue these. And that king could be David, right? Because David ruled over these people during his time. But also he talks about a star from Judah, doesn't he? That could also be a reference to David, but also I think it's a reference to the Messiah, because he talks about the kingdoms that would come about afterwards, didn't he? And so I think that's a reference to the Messiah. So, when he gets through with his 4th oracle, what's the relationship between him and Balak at this point in time?
Separating, basically.
Yeah, they separate, don't they? Let me get to the right place. Down in verse 20, chapter 24, verse 25, it says, Then Balaam rose and went back to his place, and Balak also went his way, right? So there seems to be a separation here. So if we were to end the story right now, what do we think about where Balaam's at and where Balak's at? They've gone in their separate directions, haven't they? But that's not going to be the case. Now, if you turn on over, and we were studying in chapter 25, and we talked about the people then still being there on the plains of Moab, here around Shittim, and something happens. Something happens that brings the anger of the Lord out on the people. And what was this event? Brother Jeremy.
They were in, not adultery, but harlotry with the Moabite women and worshiping, bowing down to their own God, to their gods, Baal worship.
Okay. All right, you say so here. Baal. What is the Baal? The god Baal, what was he known as? Do you remember? The god of fertility, Brother Joe.
Oh, you got it.
He was known as the god of fertility, and so when you did Baal worship, most of the time that included fornication, maybe even adultery. You know, there's someone that was bound to someone else that's over here partaking of this. But we know or at least that worship seemed to include fornication. So we see the Israelites here fall into the, we'll say the enchantments of the Midianites and the Moabites, right? And what did they start to do? They start to worship Baal. And that makes the Lord angry, right? So what does the Lord tell Moses to do? Did the Lord start a plague this time? No, sir. Brother Jolly.
He tells Moses to take the leaders of this instigation and kill them.
Have them killed. Yep. Okay? What else? Do we know? There's about 24,000 killed here. Look in chapter 25. He says, take the chiefs in verse 4 of all the people and hang them in the sun. Hang them. Do away with them. Okay? And then what does he tell the judges to do in verse 5? And Moses said to the judges of Israel, each of you kill those of his men who have yoked themselves to Baal Peor. That includes more than just these chiefs, right, I think? And so we know that day there was about 24,000. I think it's verse 9. Nevertheless, those who died by the plague were 24,000. And we talked about how we see over in 1 Corinthians where there's a different number given there. And we just talked about how that's not a contradiction of the Bible, that the 23,000 over there may not include the chiefs that were hung in the sun. We don't know. But the point being is it's not a contradiction. But what happens here is the Lord's anger is brought up against the people again, and he has these people punished to the tune of 24,000 people. Now, we have to understand that this death had started within the group of people. And we come to the story then of a young man, I'm going to say young man, but he's the son of a high priest who shows a zeal for the Lord that seems to stay this plague, right? And what was his name? Phinehas. Who was he the son of? Eleazar. Who was Eleazar at this point? Okay, Moses has taken Aaron and Eleazar and gone up on Mount Hor, and what has happened to Aaron and what happened to Eleazar?
Aaron died, and Moses stripped Aaron of his garments and put him on Eleazar, his son, and Aaron died.
That's right. Aaron's gone now, isn't he? He's part of that generation that will not go into the promised land. And we're going to study more about that soon. But he's part of that group. He will not go into the promised land. He's dead and gone. So his son Eleazar is now high priest. And his son, Phinehas, has a burning desire to do the work of the Lord and what's right. And when he sees this going on in front of and when I say going on, what was going on? They had this plague going on, right? And then it seems to be somebody just wants to be totally blatant and walk through the crowd and just show what he's going to do in his and her actions. And what was going on?
He took me and that woman, took her into his tent, right in front of everybody. And was,
Verse 14, look at the names, guys. Verse 14. The name of the man of Israel was Zimri, right? And the chief of the father's house of the Simeonites. We know who is. And then in verse 15, it tells us who the Midianite woman was. And what was her name? Cosby. So they're just going to be blatant, and they're going to go on and they're going to do their actions and let people see that, hey, we have no regard for the Lord. But what does Phinehas do? He takes a spear, doesn't he? And he follows them. And what does he do with that spear? He rams it through the midsection of both of them, doesn't he? And what does the scripture say at that time? The plague was stopped. Exactly. The plague was stopped. Because of Phinehas' urgent desire to do what was right, his desire to serve the Lord, this again stopped the plague that had started on the Israelites. And if you notice in verse 16, it says, and the Lord said to Moses, saying, harass the Midianites and strike them down, for they have harassed you with their wiles, with which they beguiled you in this matter. So he's saying, you know what? Strike these Midianites. They are guilty of helping bring this sin upon Israel. They've enticed Israel to sin. Israel did it on their own. They made the decision, but they've enticed Israel. Now, with that in mind, let's go over to verse 31, chapter 31. We're jumping over some stuff, but we want to continue on with this thought with the Midianites now. Now, who were the Midianites? Does anybody know? I think if you go back over to around Genesis 30, I think it's Genesis 30. Who were the Midianites? That was the Canaanites. They were descendants of Abraham. When Sarah died, what did Moses do? He married another woman named Keturah, didn't he? And in marrying that woman, she bore him sons. And this fourth son of the lineage you read there in that chapter, I think again it's chapter 30. You may have to check me on that. But chapter 30 talks about one named Midian. And we think that's probably who the Midianites originate from. So they are kinsmen in some way, aren't they? Of course, they all have to be at some point because they all originated from, of course, Noah after the flood. But they're kinsmen. But what they've done here is they've harassed the Israelites and brought the Israelites into fornication here that's caused this issue. And the Lord has told Moses, you harass them. But notice in verse 1 of chapter 31. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Avenge the people of Israel on the Midianites. Afterward you shall be gathered to your people. So Moses spoke to the people, saying, Arm men from among you for the war, that they may go against Midian to execute the Lord's vengeance on them. So what the Lord has said here, it's time. It's time for you, Moses, to take vengeance upon the Midianites. Now, he does say something here, we read in verse 2, where he tells Moses, after this, you're going to go to your people, right? But that's not what we're focusing on right now, because we're going to come back to that point. But right now, he's told Moses, you take men of war, or men. These men would have been from what age? 20 or what? 20 or older, right? Men of war that would go to do this battle. And what does the Lord tell Moses to do here? Does he tell him to take 2 of each tribe? 5? He tells him to take 1,000 of each tribe, doesn't he? So what we're going to see here is there's going to be an army assembled, and that army is going to consist of 12,000 Israelites. And they're going to go down, and they're going to carry out the Lord's vengeance on the Midianites for what they've done. Any questions or comments up to this point in time? So in verse 16 it says, And Moses sent them to the war, 1,000 from each tribe, together with Phinehas. Could you think of anybody better at this point in time to lead? And Phinehas is going to take the instruments and the horns. You remember about the 2 silver trumpets that were made that were to be sounded at different times, even during battle? And he's going to take those, and they're going to go down and do war against the Midianites. So in verse 7 it says, They warred against Midian as the Lord commanded Moses, and killed every male. They killed every male. Notice in verse 8, they killed the kings of Midian with the rest of their slain. And it goes through a list here, and I want you to notice the 4th name over. Cozbi, or Cozbi. What was her father's name that was mentioned back there? Do you remember? Was it not her? It talks about her being a Midian princess, right? And her father's name was, as you see right here, who was a Midianite king. So we see that we have more information about this Cozbi. All right, so they go and they kill these Midianite kings, and it says there in verse 8 there was about 5 of these kings. And notice at the latter part of verse 8, now we talked about this. If we were to have stopped this story at the point where we were talking a minute ago where Balak goes his way and Balaam goes his way, it seems that everything has resumed or gone back to normal. But who else is killed during this time at this battle? Brother Jolly. Balaam. Balaam has still never gotten over the fact that he wants, doesn't he? He has that greed, and he's never gotten over the fact, and he pays the ultimate price here, doesn't he? Because he's even killed here. He's still in with these people trying to curse the Israelites in some form or fashion. And he succeeded, didn't he? Because what Balaam does is he teaches the Midianites and the Moabites, hey, I can't curse them, but what you could do is you can take your women and you can try to entice them to come over into your sin, and that's Baal worship. And that's why it's successful, isn't it? It causes the Lord to be angry at the Israelites. And in verse 9 it says, And the people of Israel took captive the women of Midian and their little ones, and they took as plunder all their cattle, their flocks, and all their goods. And all their cities now, and we'll notice the physical, the houses and things of that nature, and all their cities in the places where they lived, and all their encampments, they burned with fire. Now notice it says encampments here, because the Midianites were known as a nomadic people. So we're not talking about necessarily walled cities, but maybe encampments that had maybe tents of some nature that they dwelled in. But what we're going to see here in this story is that even with this, there was a lot of spoils that these people had. A lot was given to, a lot was gained by Israel when they took these people. But notice what it said there about who the men of war killed. It says they killed the men, right? And they burned their encampments. They burned where they dwelled. And then they're coming back from war, and Moses and Eleazar goes out to meet them. And Moses is angry. And can anybody tell me why he's angry?
They didn't kill everybody.
Verse 14, not necessarily everybody, but look in verse 14. He particularly mentions one group because they killed the men, but who had been guilty of also helping to lure, especially the example we see of Cozbi, who was guilty of leading Israel into sin? The women. The women. And so Moses and Eleazar meet up with these men, these captains of thousands and of hundreds, and they meet up with them, and Moses is angry because the very people that helped cause the issue, you've left alive. So what does Moses tell him to do? You take all the children, the male children, and do what with them? Kill them. You take every woman that's been with a man, and what do? Kill them. He left one group, to be left as some part of, maybe they're slaves in some form or fashion, or maybe they take them to themselves at some point in time. But he leaves one group, and who was that?
The little girls that hadn't known the man.
The young women that hadn't known a man. Maybe those that had not gotten into Baal worship at this point in time. And that's who he left. Okay. Notice in verse 16, we've been talking about Balaam, and this mentions something about Balaam here again, just another point. It says, behold, these, on Balaam's advice, talking about the Midianite, and these Midianite women is what, well, let's go back to verse 15. It says, Moses said to them, have you let all the women live? And then he says, behold, these, on Balaam's advice, talking about these women, caused the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord in the incident of Peor, and so the plague came among the congregation of the Lord. Now for wipe them out. So anyway, I want to make that point about Balaam. Balaam again has succeeded in what he ultimately tried and wanted to do. I don't know that he reaped his reward as far as treasures. He did reap his reward as far as the Lord's judgment toward him. But he has successfully, in this case, brought the Lord's wrath upon the people of Israel. Okay, so they come back now. And the Lord tells Moses, you tell these people they're unclean. And they need to stay out of camp for at least a week, and they're unclean, and they need to make sure before they come back in, they're cleansed. And in verse 30, verse 19 of chapter 31, it says, encamp outside the camp 7 days. Whoever of you has killed any person, or whoever has touched any slain, purify yourselves and your captives on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. You shall purify every garment, every article of skin, all work of goat's hair, and every article of wood. And then Eleazar has something to say here. Verse 21, then Eleazar the priest said to the men of the army who had gone to battle, this is the statute of the law that the Lord has commanded Moses. Only the gold. Now, we're touching on a part here that the spoils are unclean. And so Eleazar here is giving instruction to the men of war who brought stuff back, what's to be done with these spoils. So he says there, only the gold, silver, and bronze, verse 22, the iron, the tin, and the lead, everything that can stand the fire, you shall pass through the fire, and it shall be clean. But after that, you're still to use the water of purification upon it. And then it says, verse 24, you must wash your clothes on the 7th day, and you shall be clean. And afterwards, you may come into camp. And so they take this plunder, this stuff, and themselves and their clothes, and they make sure they're purified before they come back in the camp, don't they? And then you get down into verse 26, and it starts talking about, counting the plunder and what they had there and what they had gotten. And if you go on down to verse 31, chapter 31, verse 32, it says, now the plunder remaining of the spoil that the army took was 675,000 sheep, 72,000 cattle, 61,000 donkeys, and 32,000 persons in all, women who had not known a man. So quite a large number when you talk about what they've taken here overall. Now, they're going to be expected to do something here. The Lord's going to say, you know what? Here's what I want you to do. I want you to take this spoil, and I want you to split it. And you're going to split it in half. Half of it's going to go to the men of war that went and fought this battle, and the other half's going to go to the people, to Israel. Now, the Lord's going to get his share from this too, or the Levites are going to get their share as well. But at the start, what they're going to do is they're going to take these 675,000, the 72,000 cattle, the 61,000 donkeys, and they're going to split it in half. And then the Lord's going to give direction to say, okay, for the men of war, you take this much from them and you give that to Eleazar. And the people, the congregation, you take this from them and you give this to the Levites. And it's going to be decided based on what the Lord determines the number. And if you come on down, we'll go back up rather. Verse 30 maybe. It says, and from the people of Israel half, you shall take one drawn out of every 50 of the people, of the oxen, of the donkeys, of the flocks, and all the cattle, and give them to the Levites. If you go back up to I'm missing it here somewhere. Verse 20. It's one in every 5. 500 for the soldiers. Is anybody seeing that? I'm overlooking it somewhere here. 28, okay, thank you. And the levy for the Lord, a tribute for the men of war who went out to do battle. It says, one out of every 500. So you see the Lord made a distinction there between what was given from each group. Of the people, it was one in every 50. Of the men of war that went out and did the battle, it was one out of every 500. And that's the distinction that the Lord made as far as the numbers that would be taken and given to either the priests or the people, the Levites. All right, any questions there? Okay, so Moses and Eleazar carried out the promise, or carries out the direction that they were given. And then in verse 48 it says, then the officers who were over the thousands of the army, the commanders of thousands, and the commanders of hundreds came near to Moses. Now what's going to be interesting, we're going to see, well, these men counted the people after war, and they found out that Israel didn't lose a single man in this battle. Nobody was lost. And they understand that that has to be the Lord's hand here, right? And they understand that they're sinful people. And what they do is they come and they bring the spoils that they had collected as people, and they give this to the Lord and offer it to the Lord too. And in verse 52 it says, and all the gold of the contribution that they presented to the Lord from the commanders of thousands and the commanders of hundreds was 16,750 shekels. And in verse 53 it says, the men in the army had each taken plunder for himself. And Moses and Eleazar the priest received the gold from the commanders of the thousands and of the hundreds and brought it into the tent of meeting as a memorial for the people of Israel before the Lord. So they understand what the Lord's done for them here, don't they? They understand that they took on a war and God guided them through this and they came out unscathed basically. And so they give this back to the Lord. So this is what the Lord had intended to happen to the Midianites for what they had done and causing Israel to fail, right? Now, let's go back to our narrative, back into about chapter 26. You remember when they got ready to leave Egypt, God had told Moses to count the people, didn't he? And you remember how we studied there was over 600,000 people that come out that were men of war, right? From the age of 20 and up. Well, now the Lord's going to order another census to be taken because we're getting very close. We're close to the 11th month of the 40th year. And they're getting ready. And as we see, Moses is about to go up on the mountain and look at the area, and then he's going to die. And then Joshua's going to be prepared. Before Moses died, Joshua's prepared to lead the people over. So we're coming to the end of this wandering. And here the Lord commands Moses to count the people again. And there's a significance here because what should we understand about the number here versus the number that came out of Egypt? The number that came out of Egypt was about 600,000. What do we remember about that group? When they got to Kadesh Barnea, what did they do? They came out of Egypt. There's about 600,000, 603,000 strong. They get to Kadesh Barnea and they fall, don't they? They fail. They didn't go in and take land. And the Lord says, you're going to wander. And everybody from the age of 20 years and up is going to die. You're going to wander in this wilderness. None of you will go into the promised land. So we should be coming to the point where this generation's dead, isn't it? And that's why maybe the Lord's ordering this census. So verse 2 says, take a census of all the congregation of the people of Israel from 20 years old and upward by their fathers' houses, all in Israel who are able to go to war. So we're counting the same number of people, or the same group of people again, aren't we? And of course, as you read on through 26 there, he mentions Reubenites and he mentions the tribes, and it's listed there per tribe. For example, in verse 7, it says, these are the clans of the Reubenites, and those listed were 43,730. And I'm not going to go all the way down through all of that. They got the Simeonites, you got the Gadites, Judah, all those are listed down through there. But if you come all the way down to about verse 51, we see here that the number's 601,730. So there's been a small decrease in number. Some of the tribes grew in magnitude, some of them less. But we're still talking about a group of 601,000 that are men of war. So we're still talking about a massive group of people. And we have to realize that as the fact that you remember when Balak was taking Balaam up to different parts of the mountains and different areas to see the people, he may only see a small portion of them. Still a large group of people, but there's about 601,730 at this point. And now the Lord's going to give Moses instruction about what's to happen with the land. And in verse 52, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, Among these, the land shall be divided for an inheritance according to the number of names. So we have heads of the families, right? And the Lord's saying this land is going to be divided up, and it's going to be divided up and given to them. Number one, the large tribes will receive more portion than the small tribes. And then it's going to be done by lot. So that, it's easy to see what the Lord's saying here is that, okay, you're going to give a lot of property to the larger tribes because obviously they'd have to have more, wouldn't they? But the lot part can be a little bit confusing. So I tried to study that a little bit more. And maybe what that's in reference to is that this is going to be divided by lots. So there's going to be some over by the sea, some here in the mountainous area, the middle land, a middle part of the land. But that would be divided by lot, and then the lot that tribe received would apparently be sized by the number of population they had. And that's the best way I can explain that to you. Any questions with that? So verse 55 says, verse 54 says, to a large tribe you shall give a large inheritance, and to a small tribe you shall give a small inheritance. Every tribe shall be given its inheritance in proportion to its list. But the land shall be divided by lot, according to the names of the tribes of their fathers, they shall inherit. And that's the way the Lord intends for it to be done. Down in verse 57 it says, this is the list of the Levites. So again, we're counting the Levites here too. Were they immune from the death in the wilderness? They weren't, were they? They too died. And here the Lord has said, I want to count of the people. Notice the Levites here. They are counted as well. And it talks about the tribes of the Levites here. And it goes on through verse 57 down to about verse 60. And it talks about Moses and Aaron's lineage, Miriam's lineage, right? Talks about Jochebed, the daughter. And it talks about in verse 62, and those listed were 23,000, every male. Now, when we counted the Levites originally, were they counted from age 20 and up? Notice what verse 62 tells us here. Every male from a month old and upward. Same thing again, wasn't it? And there were 23,000 of the Levites that were listed here. All right. Verse 64, but among those, there was not one of those listed by Moses who had listed the people of Israel or were a part of the list of the Israelites that were at Sinai. And we know why, right? Because of their sin, because of their refusal to go in and take the land. Now, there were some left, and we know that because there were two that came back from the spies that did not fall into the sin of the rest of them. Who was that? So Joshua and Caleb were alive. And who else? Moses at this point, right? Those three are still a part of the tribe. And Joshua and Caleb will go over into the promised land because of their response when asked about going over and taking the land. They were for it. You know, when the people started turning away, they were like Moses and Aaron. They fell down and they were begging the people, don't do this. We can go take it. If the Lord says we can do it, let's go do it. And so they're going to be rewarded for what they did. And in verse 65 says, for the Lord said of them, they shall die in the wilderness. Not one of them was left except for Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun. And those two were left. And they, of course, Joshua we know will be what? In the short period of time, he will be what? He'll be the one that will lead the children of Israel over into the promised land, won't he? All right, any questions or comments up to this point in time? Let's get over into verse 20, chapter 27 then, in our narrative. So the Lord has just told Moses to divide the land, or not to divide the land, but how the land is going to be divided, right? It's going to be done by the size of the tribe and by lot. And when this starts to happen, or when it's mentioned, there is a man who was a part of the wandering and who died because of his sins and is not going to be able to go into the promised land, but he has daughters, right? Zehoshaphat is the man we're talking about here, and that's what we're talking about in chapter 27. His daughters, when this talk of an inheritance start, they come to Moses and they said, Moses, you know, our father died for his own sins there in the wilderness, and he had no sons. And so his land's going to be given away, and we're not going to have an inheritance. Our father will not have an inheritance in the land. And they bring this to Moses' attention. And what we're going to say here is Moses is going to go to the Lord, and the Lord's going to say they're right. And so then at that point in time, now, let me say this. Go back and make this point. This is not something that the Lord fell short on. This is not something the Lord didn't think about. But the Lord took the opportunity here to give direction on how he wanted this to be done. Does that make sense? We're not doubting what the Lord did, and we can't say that when we see this that these people came to Moses and all of a sudden it reminded the Lord that, oh, I forgot this. That's not the case. But it seems to be, if you watch, because the Lord takes maybe the most opportune time to give his message or his direction when he feels like it's necessary, and that's what we have here. So, verse 1 says, Then drew near the daughters of Zelophehad, the son of Heber, the son of Gilead, son of Machir, and he was of the tribe of Manasseh. And his daughters' names, and they're listed there. You have Mahalah, Noah, Hoglin, Makah, and Tirzah. And forgive me for butchering those names. And they come to Moses, and they stand before Moses, and they make the people understand, or they tell Moses and the chiefs that their inheritance in the land is not going to happen. And in verse 3 it says, Our father died in the wilderness. He was not among the company of those who gathered themselves together against the Lord in the company of Korah. Do you remember that story, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram? He wasn't in that group, but notice what it says. But he died for his own sin, and he had no sons. And so they say in verse 4, Why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan because he had no sons? Give to us a possession among our father's brothers. And Moses brings their case to the Lord, and the Lord says, okay, you're right. And so what the Lord devises here is he says, okay, if a man comes into this, if we're in a situation where the man has no sons and he dies, then who was the property to go to? That's what we're dealing with right now, right? It was to go to his daughters, wasn't it? And then if he had no daughters, where was it to go next? The Lord develops a plan here, or he had the plan, but he at least gives them instruction on how it's to be carried out from this point on. If he had no daughters, who was it to go to? His brothers, right? His father's brothers. And if his father's brothers, if he didn't have, if it kept going down to where his father didn't have any brothers, what was it? Who was to go to? The nearest kin, wasn't it? So the Lord's making provisions here because he tells them, I want them to inherit the land by the family, right? By the tribe. And so the Lord's intent here is for that to stay within that tribe. And that's what he's doing here, is giving them direction to make sure, because these women could have very well married men from another tribe, and then the land would have become the possession of the other tribe, couldn't it? And so the Lord's making provisions here to carry out what he's told them. Is this going to go to the tribe? It's going to be an inheritance for the tribe, and that will continue. And that's what he's doing here. Let's see. Let's turn over chapter 36 real quick and continue on with this story real quickly. Because this is bringing up another point here that I just touched on ever so slightly. Now, the daughters could have married men from other tribes, right? And that causes an issue. So that's what we're about to talk about here, because we're going to see that the tribe of Manasseh comes to Moses and says, okay, Moses, what if women marry into another tribe? And that's what I just touched on. What if they marry into another tribe, and in time that possession becomes part of theirs? So then within the tribe of Manasseh, or the area of Manasseh, you may have some Reubenites or Simeonites or anyone like that inside that. And so this is going to be talked about here in chapter 36. So it said, the heads of the fathers' houses of the clan of the people of Gilead, the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, from the clans of the people of Joseph, came near and spoke before Moses and before the chiefs, the heads of the fathers' houses of the people of Israel. And they said, verse 2, they said, The Lord commanded my Lord to give the land for inheritance by lot to the people of Israel, and my Lord was commanded by the Lord to give the inheritance of Zelophehad, our brother, to his daughters. Now, here's the crux of it. Verse 3, But if they marry any of the sons of other tribes of the people of Israel, then their inheritance will be taken from the inheritance of our fathers and added to the inheritance of the tribe into which they marry. So it will be taken away from the lot of our inheritance. And notice in verse 36, because we talk about something here that we've talked about before, right? So everybody remember talking about the year of Jubilee and what happens during that time? If you had released, we called it lease, but if you had bought property from somewhere, who was it to go back to? To its original owner, wasn't it? And that's mentioned here. It says, and when the Jubilee of the people of Israel comes, then their inheritance will be added to the inheritance of the tribes into which they marry, and their inheritance will be taken from the inheritance of the tribe of our fathers. So, as we just said before, when it came to the case where these daughters had no inheritance, the Lord made provisions for that at the right time. And here we're also seeing where the Lord's going to make provision to make sure that the land is not transferred from one tribe to another because of daughters that may marry into other tribes. And it's talking about the same family primarily here, so that's why we decided to cover that. So, verse 5 says, And Moses commanded the people of Israel according to the word of the Lord, saying, The tribe of the people of Joseph is right. This is what the Lord commands concerning the daughters of Zelophehad. Let them marry whom they think best, only they had to marry what? Within the tribe of whom? Excuse me? The tribe of their father. Manasseh in this case, wouldn't they? Now, this could make it where the daughters say, hey, I'm not willing to carry that out. I'm not willing to do that. Is that their response here? It isn't, is it? What do? Verse 8, and every daughter who possesses, verse 10, the daughters of Zelophehad did as the Lord commanded, and so they married within the tribe of their father, which kept that from happening. So verse 12 says, they were married into the clans of the people of Manasseh, the son of Joseph, and their inheritance remained in the tribe of their father's clan. So again, at the proper time, the Lord here has made a standard or set a standard that these people were to follow. So if a man had daughters and no sons, and he passed, what was to happen to his inheritance? It was to go to the daughters. If he had no daughters, where was it to go then? To the man's brothers. If he had no brothers, then it was to go back to where?
His father's brothers.
His father's brothers. And then if they weren't there, it was to be the next of kin, wasn't it? So the Lord made provisions all the way back so that this land could stay within the tribe that inherited it. Also, if he did have daughters and it reached that point where it came back to the daughters, the Lord has said, okay, here's what we're going to do here. To keep the land to stay within the tribe, the original tribe, what you must do is marry within the tribe of your father. Manasseh, Ephraim, Reuben, whoever it may be, that's what was to be done so that the land did not transfer from one inheritance to another, from one group's inheritance to another. And that was the Lord's will. All right, any questions or comments about that? Okay, now let's go back again. And this time let's go back to, we've talked about the daughters of Zelophehad. I'm going to move on. At the end of chapter 27, we're going to touch on this just a minute because it starts here at this point in time. But we've talked about now that Moses would not, the Lord's told Moses because he struck the rock, he didn't give God the reverence he should have, that he would not go into the promised land, right? And here in chapter 27, starting verse 12, then the Lord takes the time to tell Moses, or Moses even talks to the Lord and says, you know what? I know I can't go over, but these people, they need somebody to lead them. And the Lord's going to make provision so that the man that he chooses is shown to be in accordance to the Lord's will, so that it would reduce the amount of dispute and things that can happen. He will indeed be the man. Just like Aaron, it was proved that Aaron would be his priest, wasn't it? So that's what we're about to talk about here. It says, the Lord said to Moses, go up into this mountain of Abram and see the land. And then, of course, we know what will happen to him. He'll be gathered to your people. And notice in verse 14, because you rebelled against my word in the wilderness of Zin when the congregation quarreled, failing to uphold me as holy at the waters before their eyes. And these, of course, was called the waters of Meribah. And Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation, who shall go out before them and come in before them, who shall lead them out and bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be as sheep that have no shepherd. Now, what has the Lord just asked? What has Moses just asked of the Lord?
I want a successor for him.
Yeah.
Because he didn't want people to go over without a shepherd.
So what does that, again, we've talked about Moses being the most humble man in the world, right? Ever. And we know Moses is coming to the end of his days. And is his concern about the end of his days? What's his concern about? Israel. We've seen this very man multiple times, stay the Lord's anger against Israel, hasn't he? Because of their actions and their hard-heartedness and the way they conducted themselves, Moses has interceded for them several times. And I think here he's interceding for them in a way as well, because he says, don't let them go as sheep without a shepherd. They need a leader. I think he probably knows. He does know. Because we'll read, as he gets talking in Deuteronomy about what can happen here. They can be blessed or they can be cursed. And when Moses is going to say, I understand that a lot of times you're going to be cursed because you're not going to follow after me. You're not going to do what I tell you or what you're told by the Lord to do. So he's asked for a leader to be put over them so they have someone to lead them. So the Lord said to Moses, take Joshua, the son of Nun. Do you think Joshua is a man worthy of this kind of honor? It's an honor, isn't it? But what do we know about, is it a task? Is it an easy task? Have we ever seen Moses have those moments where he was frustrated to the point he said, Lord, if you can't go with us, none of us can go. Or even, Lord, did I bear all these people? Are these people from my loin? These people are too many for me to manage. And we've seen Moses say those kind of things, haven't we?
He was so frustrated, he broke the Ten Commandments, broke the
He broke the law, did he? I think that's symbolic too of the fact that they had broken the law and Moses broke it as well. But yeah, has Moses ever had frustration? So my point is Joshua has taken on a job that the Lord didn't intend for him to do, but we also know it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be something that's easy because these people are quarrelsome, these people are arrogant, and they're hard-hearted people, aren't they? Now the lesson to that is, are we any different than them? I hope so, Brother Rodney.
Over in Deuteronomy 31, God tells him that he's going to go sleep with his father, Moses. So Moses hadn't dead yet. But he tells him about the coming apostasy of the children of Israel going to go a-whoring. At that time, Joshua was going to have it. They're going to go in there into the land. They're going to take these idols and start doing that, following after these other gods. So it's just a continuation of some of the things Moses went through, with what Joshua was going to face.
Oh yeah, we read at the end of the book of Joshua that after Joshua and those elders died, then there arose a generation that didn't know what?
Didn't know God.
Didn't know God. Yeah.
One generation is all it takes.
Yeah. And again, this is the generation, guys. A lot of them could have seen what happened at Mount Sinai. A lot of them could see what happened. Those 19 and younger saw what happened from Egypt all the way to Mount Sinai, even into entering the Promised Land. And the point we're making here is that no matter what all you've seen, you still can refuse to serve the Lord.
Well,
If you have a
just like you made mention a while ago, he said those daughters that survived and their father died.
yeah.
He said he didn't die from Korah's sin. So they were aware of all that. He died from his own sin, which they were aware of that. So they knew what happened
That's right.
from their parents' generation.
And you brought up a point, and I want to go back and make one point. In chapter 26, and about verse 9, you remember we talked about Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, and how that the earth opened up and swallowed those guys, and how all their families were destroyed at that point in time. And we made note that Korah, that didn't seem to be the case with Korah. And if you look in chapter 26, and I'm sorry, I meant to bring this up, verse 9, it talks about the event with Dathan and Abiram and how the earth opened up and swallowed them. Verse 10, it says, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up together with Korah. When that company died, when the fire devoured 250 men, and they became a warning. But the sons of Korah did not die. And so I had made that note before, and I wanted to make sure that we understood that not all the family of Korah died. In fact, when you get over in the Psalms, there's Psalms there written by whom? The sons of Korah, right? So we have to realize that event, and I want to touch back on that, and when Brother Rodney brought up Korah, it reminded me to do that. So sorry, I kind of jumped out of the line there, but wanted to make sure we remembered that event. Is there any other question or comments? I appreciate your time.